Too big to fail or too big to prosecute? This is a presentation by Angie French for Business Law for Ottawa University. Introduction. Known by many names, the Great Recession, the housing crisis, or the financial crisis, but it is known to all Americans as the most devastating financial event that almost destroyed the economy. It all was brought about by the perfect storm. In this section, we'll review how different areas of influence combine to create a perfect storm. First in that lineup is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. It was enacted as a partial repeal to the Glass-Steagall Act, which prevented banks from dealing in securities trading or underwriting. It repealed that decision and allowed bank holding companies to deal in securities trading and underwriting, which allowed them to remain competitive in the current economy. Second on that list was the housing bubble. According to Cockrell 2010, Holland experienced the first asset bubble over the skyrocketing tulip prices in the 1600s. There have been many asset bubbles in history, but the most impactful one during my lifetime has been the housing bubble that existed prior to the crisis. It's very interesting to note that very few understood it as a warning sign, and few agree on the length of the bubble. Too big to fail. In this infograph, we have a history of how the financial system created a AAA-rated assets out of the subprime mortgages. And it goes into details on how that system interplayed and caused interdependencies, which in turn linked each of them as they started to fail. Hurricane Katrina. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This natural disaster pushed the already struggling financial sector over the edge by kicking off an avalanche of subprime mortgage defaults. At least 1/3 of the over 400,000 mortgages that were affected by Hurricane Katrina were subprime. It wasn't just defaults on subprime mortgages that caused the collapse. It was the larger number of all defaults along with them being secured using risky at best or reckless securitization, which set the industry up to fail like dominoes. CDOs, tranches, and defaults, oh my. The subprime mortgage industry were insured with mortgage-backed securities. Those mortgage-backed securities were divided into tranches to diversify the risk, and they were divided into junior and senior tranches. The senior tranches were least risky and were paid first, while the junior tranches were paid as funds were available each month. Because of that, the idea came about to start to group the junior tranches together and combine them into CDOs, or collateralized debt obligations, that were then again split into different tranches, junior and senior, and assigned the same form of paying based on risk. And this was the beginning of the risk that became the crisis by intermingling all of these and basing them all on a subprime, already risky mortgage industry. And dominoes. Each giant fell one by one like dominoes. Large institutions start to feel the losses. In March 2008, Bear Stearns' collapse signals the beginning of the end. After an emergency loan failed, the firm was sold at a steep discount of $10 a share to JP Morgan Chase. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers files for the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history, with over $600 billion in assets. Even larger institutions then get hit hard in a scenario that was supposedly impossible. Bank of America had purchased MBNA in 2005 and Countryside Financial in 2008, which compounded its financial issues. AIG's financial arm started insuring CDOs, which were initially very lucrative, but once the foreclosures started happening, became an issue because AIG needed to pay everyone back at once, which it never thought would happen. Government bailouts. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, was signed into law on October 3, 2008. TARP provided funding to over 700 banks to keep the economy moving. All but 1% of the money invested has been paid back. GM and Chrysler were restructured in June of 2009, which was a very controversial action which is still debated by many people. Between 2009 and 2013, more than 300,000 jobs have been added in the automotive industry. The last bailout that I've mentioned here is the AIG stabilization in November 2008. Their total bailout was over $182 billion. AIG repaid a total of $205 billion by the end of 2012. Litigation. The Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, which was announced on September 16, 2008, was one of the very first pieces of litigation, in that they thought that the government would step in and assist before it got to that level and save them from bankruptcy. But in the end, they were not able to broker any deals, and they were not they did not garner federal assistance like Bear Stearns did, so they were forced into bankruptcy. And even though it was not the cause of the recession, it definitely was the turning point in understanding that it was a recession. We have the top 10 civil cases that were brought up. Most of them were brought in by the SEC, when that was against Citigroup and Brian H. Stoker, Countrywide Financial, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Goldman Sachs, IndyMac, and JP Chase and Credit Suisse. The other departments of the government that brought charges were the Department of Justice against Bank of America, the RMBS Task Force against JP Morgan Chase, and the FDIC against Washington Mutual. And then I have the outcomes and settlements, the largest of which was JP Morgan Chase at $13 billion and Bank of America at $16.65 billion. But worth noting is the IndyMac settlement for $6 million, but it was partial, and they were included in a larger settlement that was inclusive of some of the other groups on this sheet, and ended up being $350 million in addition to what's listed here. There was a striking lack of executive litigation, which was definitely a contradiction in what most common Americans wanted to see. It ended up that the Credit Suisse executive, Kareem Sarageldin, was the only executive to serve jail time. He ended up serving 30 months. The Justice Department had a climate that had shifted toward prosecuting the corporation over the individual, which definitely played a role. They had prioritized settlements over identifying individuals at blame because they were outsourcing investigations, and that was often letting the top-ranking officers off the hook in favor of receiving the settlements. It was very controversial, but was the climate at the time. After the storm, the Frank Dodd Wall Street Reform Act was helping to end the too big to fail and taxpayer bailouts. It put in regulations to help prevent this from happening in the future, and it put in place more monitoring and as well as the regulations. And then we have the references. There is definitely no lack of subject matter on this, and hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.